I will go ahead and get started then. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is George Kevin Jordan, and I'm the editor-in-chief here at Greater Washington for its publication. And we're really excited that you all could join us tonight for this continuing conversation. We're exploring the history, current policies, and intersections between school boundaries and feeder patterns in DC's public schools, and their connection to land use, housing, and transportation issues. I did want to take a second to excuse me, to talk about some housekeeping for a second. The webinar is being recorded. You can feel free to use the chat to ask questions and chat amongst yourselves. We really want to hear from as many people as possible. At the bottom of your screen, you see the little tab that says Q&A. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you can feel free to put your questions in there, and we'll be monitoring the chat and making sure that your questions are answered. But back to the webinar, as I said, I'm really excited to be able to, that we're able to offer this webinar that really builds on the journalism that we've been able to do. We have our journalists here who wrote the series, as well as all the panelists that are featured today. We're also featured in the articles. So this is an example of how we're rolling out more ways to engage with you directly with the stories that we produce. And we're really excited for this opportunity. So stay tuned for more types of programming like this. As I said before, this webinar, and when we have at least one a month, is part of our Intersections, which is GGWash's recurring educational webinar series. And this webinar is made possible with the grant from Education Forward DC. And I also, speaking of them, I want to thank Education Forward DC for the grant support that made this limited series in the webinar possible. I also want to thank our amazing panelists, Chelsea Coffin, Dan Reed, and Councilmember Christina Henderson for participating in the event. And of course, I want to thank our moderator and journalist behind the series that we're talking about tonight, Abby Higgins. And speaking of Abby, I'm going to introduce her now. Abby is a freelance journalist based out of DC and covering poverty, inequality, gender health, and labor for publications including The Washington Post, The Nation, The New Republic, and now Greater Washington. She works part-time as an editor at DCSWAMU, and she is going on organizing committee for the Freelance Solidarity Project at the National Writers Union. Prior to DC, she lived in Kenya for a decade, working as a foreign correspondent throughout East Africa. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Abby.
Thanks so much, George, and thanks everyone else for attending tonight. I'm really excited about this panel. So before introducing our panelists, I'm just going to give a little bit of a background on this series and why we wrote it. So in the United States, Black and white students are more segregated today than they were during the Civil Rights Movement. And unfortunately, Washington, DC is no different. DC is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and its school boundaries reflect that segregation. They also reflect historic redlining maps and divide students not only by race, but by resources, with predominantly white schools experiencing better test scores, but more teachers and often better facilities in schools. The city's school boundaries were last redrawn during a pretty heated and sometimes controversial process in 2014. But prior to that, they had not been redrawn since 1968. Under an act introduced by at-large Councilmember Christina Henderson, who is one of our panelists today, redistricting would occur every 10 years and would next be due in 2024. As I said, that process was controversial in a lot of different ways. It wasn't the only education debate that was gripping the city at the time. Tensions were already high, as 1/10 of DC public schools were slated to close as part of a plan to shutter under-enrolled campuses as charter schools were proliferating in the city. It wasn't lost on many parents at the time that these schools were located entirely in the city's neighborhoods east of Rock Creek Park and east of the Anacostia River, where the city's lower income neighborhoods tend to be located. DC is still grappling with a lot of the questions that it was grappling with in 2014. Should the city focus on choice, allowing students to attend a variety of schools across the city, or invest in neighborhood schools where kids go to whatever school their address assigns them to, or should the city land somewhere in between? And which of these solutions, or like which of these ideas, are going to best serve DC's students? I am excited to hear about all of these topics from our panelists today, who I will introduce before turning it over to them. Our first panelist is Dan Reed, who is Greater Greater Washington's Regional Policy Director, focusing on housing and land use policy in Maryland and Northern Virginia. For a decade prior, Dan was a transportation planner, working with communities all over North America to make their streets safer, enjoyable, and equitable. Their writing has appeared in publications including Washingtonian, City Lab, and Shelter Force, as well as Just Up the Pike, a neighborhood blog founded in 2006. Dan now lives in Silver Spring with his dog Drizzy. Our next panelist, Chelsea Coffin, is the director of the Education Policy Initiative at the DC Policy Center. Her research focuses on how schools connected to broader dynamics in the District of Columbia. She has authored reports on diversity in DC's schools, neighborhood characteristics of where students attend their in-boundary school, and other enrollment patterns. Our third panelist is Councilmember Christina Henderson, who is an at-large member of the Council of the District of Columbia. She has held this position since January of 2021. Councilmember Henderson's career has been guided by the principle that one's zip code should not determine your opportunity for success. Prior to her election, Councilmember Henderson counseled United States senators, state, and local education officials. As a council staffer, she crafted and helped to advance over 40 pieces of legislation on an array of issues, including student discipline, DCPS facilities, reproductive health, medical marijuana, and beverage sales at breweries, distilleries, and wineries. Prior to the council, she worked for DC Public Schools, supporting the district's efforts to improve teacher and school leader quality and effectiveness. Councilmember Henderson is passionate about centering equity in her work. Great. So just to give you all a little bit of an idea of how this is going to work, we're going to listen to a short presentation from each of our panelists, or presentation or discussion about the particular things that they're thinking about when it comes to school boundaries, housing, transportation, and equity in DC. And then I will ask some questions, and then we will be soliciting questions from the audience. So we would love you to drop questions into the chat or comments as we're talking. We hope this can be as participatory as possible. So with that, I will turn things over to Dan.
Thank you so much, Abby. My name is Dan Reed. As mentioned, I'm Greater Washington's Regional Policy Director. I'm super happy to be here today. My work mainly focuses on housing policy in Maryland and Virginia, though I've been active on school issues, particularly in Montgomery County, for over a decade. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical relationship between housing and schools. And a lot of the examples I'm going to use are from Montgomery County, but I think there's lessons we can learn from both. So let me get my screen going here. All right, can everyone see it okay? Cool. All right, so Montgomery County had a problem. Its schools were overcrowded, particularly its more highly ranked schools, so it did what any community would logically conceive to do. It stopped approving new homes near schools, right? That makes sense. If there were no new homes, no new people can come, which means there are no new students. It did not work that way because naturally homes turn over, and the policy was finally shelved in 2020. But it shows that from the jump, schools and housing were intertwined as two policies. From the jump, as in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as the DC and the region grew, discrimination was a big and very explicit selling point in some of the region's most desirable neighborhoods. Behind that was the idea that you could buy access to a certain community and the ostensibly public amenities within, things like schools, parks, transportation facilities, shopping, and so forth, and that there were a series of tools that could be used to keep other people out and protect your access to the wealth provided by those public amenities. Here are some of the tools that were used. One of them was racial covenants. Basically, this was language in the contract of your home that would say you could not sell your house to a Black person, to a Middle Eastern person, to a Jewish person. Sometimes it'd be language like any race with a higher death rate than the white race. In the most exclusive neighborhoods, sometimes they'd restrict even Catholics from buying. And while the Supreme Court ruled this basically unconstitutional in 1948, the damage had been done, and there were huge swaths of the DC area that were basically already set aside as neighborhoods for white people. Another tool was zoning. This first appeared in the early 1910s or so, and initially many cities like Baltimore had racial zoning. This block was for white residents, this block was for Black residents. In 1916, the Supreme Court case, Buchanan v. Warley, ruled this was unconstitutional, but around the same time, a gentleman in Berkeley, California, realized he could still keep out a Black-owned dance hall and a Chinese-owned laundry by designating his neighborhood exclusively for single-family homes. And 10 years later, the Supreme Court upheld that in their decision Euclid v. Ambler, in which they described apartment buildings as a parasite on desirable neighborhoods. So cities all over the country made maps like this one. This is DC's map from 1936, and the colors are still used today. These yellow areas here are areas that are the most restrictive. You can only build single-family homes. The brown areas, a little bit less so. The red areas, you can build maybe more of a mix of row houses and some commercial activities, and the purple areas are even less restrictive. But you can see this is a map. Basically, Woodley Park is on the left here, and Columbia Heights is on the right. Rock Creek Park is in the middle. There was now being set in stone this pattern in which the most expensive exclusive housing was on one side of the park and everybody else was on the other. Come on. Here we go. The next tool was redlining. Following the Great Depression, the federal government wanted to find ways to basically insure people's mortgages so they wouldn't lose their homes. And one of the tools used to determine who could have access to these government-backed mortgages and in what areas was called redlining. There were maps like this made of cities all over the country. This is DC's map, and it shows Maryland and Virginia as well. It's called redlining for a reason I'll get to in a second. But the darker colored areas here are rated A, B, and C. These are generally the communities that have the highest end housing and are exclusively white neighborhoods. You can see a pattern emerge. These are the neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park in DC and in Montgomery County. Other areas had lower grades like C, D, E, F. These were in general white neighborhoods that were working or middle class. And then finally, the lowest grade of neighborhoods like H were Black neighborhoods. And those were neighborhoods, all these lighter colored neighborhoods are basically increasingly off limits to mortgages and the opportunity to build generational wealth that comes with it. And even though redlining as a practice was outlawed in 1977, again, these tools all sort of converged to create a pattern that we still see in our schools today. This is a zoom in of the inside the Beltway part of Montgomery County. This is that map from 1936. The green areas have the higher grades and thus were considered higher end, wealthier white neighborhoods. These pink colored ones were more working class white neighborhoods, the G, and the H was a neighborhood that allowed Black residents to live in there today. So here's a map from 80 years later showing the racial makeup of those same neighborhoods. You can see what these neighborhoods were graded on a map in 1936. And the split is very clear, right? The neighborhoods west of the park that had the highest grades in the redlining map are still overwhelmingly white today. And the neighborhoods on the east side that were either more working class or were Black neighborhoods are much more racially diverse today. And that tracks with median household income. And it's so fine-grained that even here, this area here on the left is Bethesda. This little section here that was graded C in 1936, it had a slightly lower grade than the neighborhoods around it, today still has lower median household incomes than the neighborhoods around it in a fairly wealthy area. And east of the park, you can see much lower household incomes. And that tracks with home values. These were the areas on the left-hand side that 80, 90 years ago, the federal government said these are the highest end neighborhoods, and today they remain as such. And here's what that looks like in terms of school enrollment. This is a map of the percentage of white and Asian students in Montgomery County elementary schools. And it is arguably the same map. You have Rock Creek Park running through the middle. On the left-hand side are the schools that are majority white. On the right-hand side, the schools that are majority non-white. And because non-white people have had opportunities to build generational wealth denied repeatedly over and over again through all these different tools and others we aren't even talking about, that tracks with the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch. And so we have this condition in Montgomery County, and I'm sure you'll find this in other jurisdictions as well, where you can map, here are the 25 high schools in Montgomery County. The blue bar is the students on free and reduced lunch. The orange bar are the percentage of students who scored 3 or higher on AP exams. The gray bar are the percentage of Black students with the 3 or higher. And there's this inverse relationship now where the schools that were basically in areas that were off limits to less affluent and non-white people, basically you have the most resources and are showing dramatically higher performance because they have access to those resources, where the schools in other parts of the county where the students with the greatest needs or the most disadvantaged students are concentrated, the performance is lower. And people work very hard to keep that status quo in which they perceive the schools in the wealthier areas as being better simply by virtue of who attends them. This is a map of from Montgomery County school boundary analysis, which was performed 2 or 3 years ago, looking at where school boundaries have been changed by the Board of Education over the past 40 years. And once again, it's schools on the eastern side of the county, east of Rock Creek Park, the areas that historically were more racially and socioeconomically diverse and were basically kept that way, were the areas that saw the most school boundary changes. Whereas on the western side of the county, particularly in this area here of Bethesda, those school boundaries have largely stayed the same for 40 years because you've created a situation in which the neighborhoods are perceived as being more valuable. People pay more to live in them, to have access to these public amenities like schools. The schools are perceived as better because of who goes to those schools. And so residents fight to keep access to these public amenities, or as education researcher Marco Petrilli has called them, private public schools. This is a picture of Whitman High School. These are homes that are for sale in the Whitman High School cluster. These are perhaps an extreme example, but it's an expensive place to live. And the map 80 years ago determined it should be as such. And like I said, people fight to keep it that way. This is one of the community meetings for the school boundary analysis 3 years ago, in which parents who might identify themselves as progressive, as liberal, as supportive of diversity, actively fought and booed a student who talked about it because they were so fearful of losing access to a public amenity they had paid for. We've created a system in which people have these very perverse incentives to do things that they say they don't believe in because of how school boundaries have drawn, and in turn, the maps that they were based on from much longer ago. So that's my piece. I know I talk kind of fast. I'm happy to answer questions later on.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was such a helpful framing for how we got to where we are now, and how we keep perpetuating the same cycles. I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea next for a bit of a discussion about the DC lottery system and some of her education on some of her research on education in DC.
Thanks so much, Abby and Dan. I'll try to do my best to do Dan's presentation justice and pick up where he left off and provide a little more context around school boundaries in DC. Abby, can you see my screen?
I can.
Great. Okay, so again, I'm just going to provide some context around school boundaries in DC. This is based on our research at the DC Policy Center. And I'll start with just a little bit of a framing around school boundaries and context for DC, which is a little bit different than Montgomery County and some of the areas that Dan was describing. Towards the end of his presentation, the school boundaries in DC, about a quarter of public school students attend their in-boundary DCPS school. This looks at enrollment in DC's public schools by sector for last school year, and after in-boundary schools, about half of students attend public charter schools. And then about 20% of students attend a DCPS school as an out-of-boundary school. There are also some students who attend DCPS application high schools or citywide high schools. So we have a little bit of nuance around who the boundaries are working for, and kind of the degree, who the percentage of students who are participating in them. And then just because the common lottery is such a part of how students are assigned and how students get a spot at these out-of-boundary DCPS schools or public charter schools, Abby asked if I could go over the My School DC common lottery. This comes from the My School DC website and from our report on equitable access preference for at-risk students in the common lottery. But just to give you a sense of the common lottery, it's a single random lottery that determines placement for new students at all participating schools, which is almost all public charter schools and DCPS schools. And in DC, students use the common lottery if they're applying for any pre-K 3 or pre-K 4 spot as a new student, including their DCPS school as an in-boundary school. Any DCPS school that's outside of their boundary, this includes DCPS selective high schools, and citywide programs, and also any public charter schools. So it really is a pretty expansive common lottery. Families can rank up to 12 schools before the lottery deadline, and students are only matched with one school, and they receive a wait list for other schools they rank that are higher than the school where they match. And then after lottery results are released, families they actually enroll at the school where they match. And then there's also a post-lottery period where students can still be assigned to their schools through the lottery. So it seems complex, but it is something that brings all of these public school choice options into one place for families and students. So I'll shift back to looking at school boundaries and pick up with some of the maps that link to what Dan was speaking about, and just talk about the geographic variation in who attends their in-boundary school in DC. These maps look at 3 different kind of public school choice options. The first on the left is boundary participation rates. So for elementary schools, the darker green indicates where students are more likely to attend their in-boundary school. The middle chart looks at out-of-boundary participation rates. So who's attending a DCPS school as an out-of-boundary student. And then on the right, we have public charter school participation rates. So this draws on our schools in the neighborhood report from 2018. It's a little bit outdated, but I can say that looking at the trends, we haven't seen huge shifts in the distribution of these participation rates. So if you look at the boundary participation rates on the left, you can see that that there are certain pockets of the city, generally west of Rock Creek Park within the Jackson-Reed feeder pattern, and certain pockets of Capitol Hill where boundary participation rates are really high. For elementary school, within the Jackson-Reed feeder pattern, for elementary schools, they're as high as 77%, which is more than half the average for elementary school boundary participation, which is 31%. So it's just important to think about who's benefiting and who boundaries are working for currently in DC. And then when we also think about variation for boundaries, another important point to consider is that boundary participation is highest in elementary school. This chart is outdated. You see we reference Wilson here, now Jackson-Reed again, but these patterns haven't shifted that much since our schools in the neighborhood report. This looks at boundary participation within elementary, middle, and high schools for DCPS. So you can see that in general, the boundary participation rates get lower as students grow older. When you look at the numbers, again, 31% of elementary school students attend their in-boundary school compared to 23% of high school students. And you can see that where boundaries participation is high really narrows as students grow older. By the time you get to high school, it's really just within the Jackson-Reed feeder pattern where we see high boundary participation rate, which is 68% at the time when we published this report. And again, these maps are linked and connected to a lot of the maps that Dan showed around redlining or racial covenants, or the zoning maps for DC. So I'm just pulling out 2 more maps from the schools in the neighborhood report to talk about a couple of neighborhood characteristics that mirror school boundary attendance zones. And when we look at these maps, you can see the one on the left looks at elementary school boundaries for DCPS and the percent of the population who is Black. And you can see that where boundary participation is highest in those neighborhoods that are generally west of the park and pockets of Capitol Hill, you can see that these neighborhoods tend to have the smallest percentages of residents who are Black. And, kind of around the neighborhood of 2 to 5%, compared to up to 98% in some other neighborhoods, especially east of the river. And then another characteristic I wanted to share is just that the private school enrollment in DC is also highest in these neighborhoods west of the park. It's as high as 44%, according to US Census data. It's a little hard, this bounces around a little bit from year to year, but it's 44% generally within this, the Jackson Reed feeder pattern west of Rock Creek Park. And where boundary participation is highest. So we're seeing this different type of school choice where there are families who are purchasing a home and they really want to attend their in-boundary school, or there are families who opt out and go to private school within this area. And the rest of the city, it's more of a mix. About 15% of students attend private schools citywide. So I'll stop there and thank you. Looking forward to the rest of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. That was really helpful context for contemporary education in DC and how some of these inequalities, why some of these inequalities exist and how they're maintained. I am next going to turn to Council Member Christina Henderson, who is going to talk to us a little bit about her Attendance Zone Boundaries Amendment Act of 2022 and why she believes it's important and some of the things that she observed during redistricting in 2014 and why some of those observations convinced her that regular redistricting was important for DC.
Thanks so much for that. I feel a little out of place here with Dan and Chelsea because I don't have a PowerPoint. So sorry for those out there who was looking forward to that. And I want to apologize for running a little bit behind. We did have our first council meeting back of the fall. And as you can imagine, the agenda was pretty packed, but I'm glad to be here and thank you so much for the invitation. How we came about introducing legislation, the attendance bill, which is actually a very simple bill, and it requires DCPS to engage in an analysis and, if necessary, revision of school boundaries in DC every 10 years. And you wouldn't think that that is a radical idea, but how we got here was when we did the school boundary revision process, or this, I'll say the student assignment, because that's how they refer to it. The student assignment revision process in 2014, it was the first time that DC had engaged in this process in 40 years. That's right, 40. We had not done this in 40 years. In the meantime, however, we had done several rounds of school closures, but I don't feel like, and I was also a staffer on the council at the time. And then prior to that, I had worked at DCPS during when we started, I think it would have been the second round of school closures. The communication in terms of the school closure piece, but also going forward, wasn't necessarily, I would say, grounded in the history to explain why we had so many schools in DC that were literally right across the street from each other, right? So you would, I'll give you one example of on the Hill, Maury Elementary is literally, I would say, maybe 3 blocks from Minor Elementary. And so people weren't really understanding the history, especially for new individuals who had, I would say, more recently arrived to the district. They didn't realize, like, yes, the reason we have so many school buildings is because DC used to be segregated. We had a white school, we had a Black school. So we had double the number of everything that we needed because we were so, well, at the time, the law was intentional in terms of segregating students. And so what I observed during that process in 2014, which I have to say, because it was the first time that we had done it in 40 years, the Deputy Mayor for Education's office, I felt, tried very hard to do it with care. So they set up an advisory committee to consider a lot of these weighty issues. They were very data focused and data driven, providing files, providing policy briefs, providing basically all of the information that they were considering in committee and trying to be very transparent about it. The additional thing that they also did as well was a number of in-person community meetings across the city, which is really where we got to the meat of the issue of hearing people react to ideas and talk about their ideas in terms of values around that. It was a recommendation of the advisory committee that DC engage in this process every 10 years. But unfortunately, elections have consequences. So in the time that we got the final recommendations, there had been an election, there was a change in mayoral administration, and this was something that fell off. And so, and I know there are some people in the comments here who probably remember, it had been sort of thought about in the education community, oh, we're about to go through a school boundary revision process coming up here. And then when I went to actually go look for it in either regs or code, I realized it never made it. And so that was the impetus for my introducing the legislation. There have already been occasions in DC. I think the information that Dan showed earlier about what had been happening in Montgomery County with who makes revisions where and at what parts of the county gets revisions in terms of school assignment, I thought was very interesting and unique. DCPS has resisted revisiting this issue and has instead chosen in some cases to spend millions of dollars to build additions onto schools as opposed to doing what is, I would say, a more politically fraught process, which would be to change some lines. And so, yeah, I think it's time. And so that's why I introduced this legislation. We did pass it in the budget process, and so it is law. So we are anticipating us gearing up for this conversation shortly.
Great, thank you so much. So that's maybe I think a great jumping off point. Since we are gearing up for this process, as a couple different people have touched upon, and as you obviously just outlined, there was a lot that was difficult about 2014. What I'd love to hear first from Councilmember Henderson, but then I would also be curious to hear from the other panelists as well. How can we design a solid redistricting process that centers equity?
Well, I think it again has to start with what is the design of the process that the Deputy Mayor for Education and the Chancellor are going to take? Are they going to choose to use an advisory committee again? Yes, no. Who are you going to appoint for those conversations? And then also, how transparent are you going to be with the data upfront about the process? I think, even as a first term member in my second year, I think people know by now, I try to do my research as much as possible. When we were doing this through the budget process, of course, the Deputy Mayor for Education came back and said, I forget how much they quoted of how much this was going to cost, but I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, there's no way that is going to cost like X million of dollars in order for us to do a school boundary revision process. Knowing that surrounding jurisdictions do this on a pretty regular clip, and it shouldn't break the bank to do so. But yes, if you do feel like your staff and your offices aren't equipped for this conversation, aren't equipped to facilitate and moderate, but also push the envelope in terms of ideas, let's do that. But I also very much know, I talked to the people who own the product software that we've used. It's very similar if anyone engaged in the political boundary redistricting process. You put in the data, you see where the lines are existing, and then it's a point and click, and let's try to make some things work here. I think one of the things that is going to be a challenge for certain parts of the city when we talk about equity is that we have to acknowledge that certain parts of the city have also seen a population boom in terms of young people, in terms of school age children, or in terms of preschool age children versus others. And how do we deal with that? And then also, how do we deal with just sort of I would say, somewhat uncertainty around what the student enrollment population look like going forward for the next 10 years. But I know, in my area of I represent the whole city, but I live in Ward 4. So I see it more on a regular basis. When I look back at the data from 2014, the number of school age kids in the boundary for an elementary school in my area already exceeded the capacity of that building in 2014. And we've already just know, like, it's going to be, what happens there. I think also part of the equity conversation is around new schools. And so with that, a lot has happened, right? DCPS has given up some buildings in some areas that is now seeing a resurgence in terms of young people population. Are we building new facilities? What does that look like? So I think if we're going to talk about equity in terms of it, it starts with what is the design of the process? How do people feel like they're going to be heard? And then also the transparency piece as well. Everybody may not be able to accept the outcomes, right? But I feel like everybody needs to believe that the process was fair, transparent, and it considered all of the ideas on the table.
Great, thank you. My cat just almost knocked over my computer. I'd actually love to broaden that question out a little bit and direct it to you, Dan. I thought that I hadn't heard the term private public schools before. It's such a good encapsulation of some of the phenomenons that you were talking about. And along those same ideas, I'd like to think about the idea of buying into a public good, which is something that you talked about. It's something that Councilmember Henderson talked about. And it sounds like that is one of the things that really plays into resistance to redistricting. People feel like they bought a home within, and often a very, very expensive home within the boundaries of for a particular school. And then they expect that those boundaries should stay the same because they spent a lot of money for them. And so I'm wondering first of all, how we unravel this idea that you can purchase a public good. It's a very difficult idea to unravel in the United States because we have a lot of systems that allow you to purchase public goods. And perhaps more importantly, how do we make it harder to purchase public goods when it comes to public education? And is redrawing school boundaries part of that? So I'll ask Dan first, and then Councilmember Henderson. Maybe you have some additional thoughts now that I've broadened things out a little bit.
Thank you. There's a lot there. I'm not sure that we can make public goods not totally not a commodity in a capitalist society. But I think we can do things to help sort of break the connection between you're paying a lot of money to have access to this public school that is perceived as better than all the other ones. One is looking at how, within a school district, how equitably are we funding different schools? One thing they found in Montgomery County is that PTAs and some of the wealthier catchments could raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for amenities for their schools, whereas it'd be other schools where the PTAs either didn't exist or weren't raising any money. So that's entirely outside of the public system. Are there ways to maybe encourage sharing of those funds, or for the school system to provide for those less affluent schools something equivalent or similar to that kind of funding? One is, I think, as Councilwoman Henderson mentioned, like having regular redistricting processes so that people know to expect it, and that the school system can not only like redraw boundaries without perhaps as much people quite as much furor around them, but so that it can actually best allocate resources, right? One of the issues in Montgomery County is we have schools that are very overcrowded next to schools that are very underutilized, and they might be just a few streets apart, and you can't fix that because we can't redraw the boundaries. And so you end up restricting where new homes can be built instead. There may be schools where students are being bused miles out of the way, and there's a school closer to them because of some sort of historical quirk, right? These are ways in which the school system is actually not using its resources to its best, to the most effective use, which in turn means we can't provide as much to all of our students. And so school boundaries are certainly not the only solution, but having a regular process for doing that can start to unlock a lot of things.
Great, thanks. Councilmember Henderson, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Dan said in terms of the regular process. I looked at, and let me just say, the school assignment revision process is not only controversial in places like DC, Maryland, and Virginia, across the country, particularly in the South. And, you know, in grad school, I did some looking at what was going on in Wake County, North Carolina, what was happening in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina, right, where it gets nasty. And it is about race and class, and it's messy and all of these different things. And I feel like when you having a regular process, people don't necessarily feel like they're being quote unquote duped, right? Or you're taking what Dan said, or what you also said, Abigail, right? Like about like the ownership of this public good, but sort of the language of you're taking a seat from my child. You're taking a seat. I bought into this boundary. I bought into this school, and sort of thinking about it from that perspective. But yeah, I'm just trying to, like, I feel like efficient governments and cities have these periodic conversations, and it goes through the conversations of resources and other things. And I think if we took stock of how much money we have spent in the District of Columbia to avoid redrawing school boundaries, people would be embarrassed because, yeah, I feel like people would be embarrassed.
Thanks. I'd love to turn to you, Chelsea. You gave some really helpful grounding for the ways in which school boundaries look very different in DC, and the ways that when we're trying to think about how to make education in DC more equitable, school boundaries are, as Dan said, one solution. They're definitely not the only solution, and particularly in DC, they are not the only solution. I know that you guys have done some research about increasing at-risk preference in the lottery. I was honestly a little shocked to learn that 45% of DC students qualify as at risk, which is that's because they're homeless or they're in foster care, or their parents receive cash or food assistance from the government, or they're overage in high school. Could you talk a little bit about generally ways that we could make the lottery system more equitable in DC, and particularly the at-risk preference in the lottery?
Sure, thanks, Abby. I think the general kind of belief behind the lottery is that it does, and behind some of these issues we're talking about, is a little bit about what Dan and the Councilmember Henderson were talking about, kind of de-linking these strong connections between housing and school boundaries, and it does weaken those connections a little bit. When we did research on the equitable access preference, which gives a preference in the common lottery for students who are designated as at risk, we were thinking about ways to shift certain demographics at certain schools in DC that tend to serve more affluent families. And I think one of the issues with the common lottery is that there is a sibling preference for in the lottery, which has very practical implications for families who want their kids at the same school. One drop off is great, but also it has implications for schools that are trying to shift who they serve and pivot quickly. And if you are a school that attracts a lot of applications and you only have a certain number of spots, and many of your spots are going to siblings, no matter how much you recruit and try to reach certain students and families, you're never going to be able to shift whom you serve. For example, when we did our study for the equitable access preference at DCPS schools that had a rating of 5 or on the STAR on the STAR report card, 70% of pre-K3 seats went to siblings. So you just don't have enough space to really move. And we're talking about schools for our study that serve between 5 and kind of 15% of students who were designated as at risk, compared to about half of students, as Abby is talking about. So I think the equitable access preference is a way that within the current system that we have, that families who prefer a certain school, instead of just siblings and some other preferences being able to move to the front of the line, students who are designated as at risk have that preference also. There are trade-offs with this approach, but I think in general for the 25 schools, DCPS and public charter that have adopted this approach, I really want to keep an eye on the implications it has, especially in those pre-K years, and especially for DCPS schools where we're seeing demographics shift very rapidly in the 16th Street corridor in particular, and access to those pre-K3 spots is really critical for families that for whom paying for an additional 2 years of childcare or figuring out some other arrangement is more difficult. So I'll stop there, but I do think it is a step in the right direction.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn to transportation and thinking about the ways that transportation intersects with some of these issues that we've discussed. Obviously, transportation is something that students anywhere deal with. How do they get to school? How do they get to and from school? The fact that DC has a lottery is one of the reasons. That means that some DC students are commuting particularly a little bit further from school than, maybe going to the school that they're physically closest to. On average, students commute just over 2 miles to and from school, and about 42% of students leave their ward. But that number varies quite a bit. And obviously students' commutes look quite different. DC has a problem with high rates of car crashes and pedestrian accidents. DC also struggles with violence issues. Different students' commutes look very different. So how can we improve students' commutes and how can we make them more equitable? I'd love to hear from everyone on this, but maybe Chelsea first, since I know you've done some research on this.
Sure. Thanks so much, Abby. I think a lot of these, I think you're talking about a lot of different issues. There's a lot to unpack. I think the issue of safe passage to school is something that's been top of mind when we've done some listening sessions with students. It's something that, especially as students are coming back to school and getting used to be on those commutes, and as some public safety issues have shifted during the pandemic, it really it is a real concern. And for students who have a longer commute, they have more time, more transit. So I think with a lot of these kind of where you choose to go to school, especially for high school students who are older and more likely to be traveling farther, there are trade-offs. I think DCPS does offer a lot of, several citywide application high schools for specialized programming. There are also specialized programming for other grades. So I think there is this tension between a preference for a certain school quality, however families define that for their child, and commute time. And I do think that a focus on safe passage to school. I want to look more at kids ride free options. Take up, it's been really low, and kind of thinking about transit and how kind of how kids are actually getting to school, especially for these longer commutes, and on which routes are the most traveled, would be a good place to start.
Great. And just to clarify, if anyone doesn't know, DC has a program called Kids Ride Free, where DC students can ride public transportation for free. And Chelsea, if it sounds like you're saying that there is some limited uptake of the program, and we don't quite yet know why that's the case.
Yeah, I think if you look at we looked at the ridership levels this school year compared to pre-pandemic, and they're much lower. Public transit in DC is down in general, but the student ridership is way down. There's some issues with fare evasion, but doesn't seem like it would quite explain the 90% decline. I think when we're talking about safe passage, and I'm sure that there are people who are doing this in the DC government, but just thinking about which routes are most likely to be traveled by students, looking at the limited Kids Ride Free data to find out which routes those are, which metro stops, which bus stops, where are students transferring and maybe having to wait at certain spots. Anyway, I just think that there is an ability to use data, especially for high school students who have longer commutes, to figure out where for safe passage issues. I'm sure people are thinking about this. It's just something that comes to mind for me.
Great, thanks. Councilmember Henderson, how are you thinking about school commutes and equity?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of in this conversation, I think I mentioned in the article was that we like to talk about choice, but the reality is if you can't get to the choice, then it's not really a choice, right? And so even with a program like Kids Ride Free, or why we were seeing, ridership down, we know we have issues with WMATA, so we're going to put that to the side for a second, right? But at the same time, like, I have a 3-year-old. I'm not putting the 3-year-old on Metro to go across the city for school, right? So I think there are lots of families who are having to make these types of choices. And interestingly enough, when you talk about even out of boundary feeder patterns or other things, you have to get in the pre-K 3 or the ECE years in order to be able to access some of these things, some of these choices. Even when we talk about middle grades, right? We have a slew of charter schools who begin middle grades at 5th grade. And I don't know very many parents who would feel comfortable putting a 5th grader on a Metro bus or a Metro train by themselves for this commuting process, right? And all of this is like so interesting I grew up as a military brat, so we moved around quite a bit. New York City, obviously, they don't use school buses in the same way that you would see in suburban areas. But in high school, when I went to high school in Georgia, even though they had their version of quote unquote choice, from magnet school systems, there were still school buses. So I would get on the bus in my, neighborhood. All of the buses would meet in the parking lot of the main library, and then students would literally do a switch. So you would go switch from your bus that you took to the spot, and then you get on another bus to get to your school. And that is how they sort of manage moving around families, but also allowing choice. Now, that is expensive. I'm not even going to lie. And not even expensive from a bus standpoint, but we already know a lot of our counties are already dealing with a driver shortage. So adding something to that, I'm not sure if that's a tenable solution to our transportation challenges and issues. But I would say this, for us, it is also around doubling down on ensuring that every family has a choice in their neighborhood and walking distance that works for their family. And I know that is not, panacea in terms of what we're going to, well, that is panacea. That is something that we want. I know that there are some families who are looking for very specialized programs, whether it be language immersion or Montessori or arts or those kinds of things. And we certainly need to have those available. But if a family doesn't even have to look for that choice, because their neighborhood works for them, I think that is really what we have to be working towards. And I know that is something that I'm working towards in terms of, a baseline, like let that be your baseline. And then if you want to explore beyond that, I don't feel like we're having this larger issue, but there are, in my opinion, far too many families, especially in Ward 7 and 8, who are making some ridiculous commutes on a day-to-day basis. I have a friend who lives in Congress Heights. Their kid goes to elementary school in Georgetown. And she works in Ward 4. So it's like a doop, 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 right? And so I think that has to be part of the conversation. And again, and in some ways that's kind of separate and apart from the student assignment process, because whoever is making those decisions are not necessarily making decisions on the academic quality of a school. They literally are talking about building utilization, programmatic alignment, and where people live.
Thanks, Dan.
I had an interesting experience of transportation in school growing up. I grew up in Silver Spring. I went to a magnet school in Rockville. My dad worked in Arlington, and we had one car. So rather than putting me on a bus for 2 hours every morning, we drove from Silver Spring to Arlington and then back out to Rockville every morning. So I would get to school at 10:30 sometimes, but that was, it felt like the only available choice that there was. And so, I think the school transportation question is a commute question, just like the commute that we have to work, right? It's more challenging because whereas, DC might have one downtown with sort of ancillary areas around it where people commute in and out every morning, the schools are everywhere, right? And so you have these very dispersed sort of origins and destinations that make it challenging to serve every possible trip, right? And so I think part of the solution is giving people better choices near their homes, and like near can be relative, right? As in you don't have to travel all the way across the city to find a school that meets your needs. I think the other question is, we haven't talked about it quite as much, but are there scenarios where people don't feel safe letting their kid walk or bike to school even when the school is close, right? In transportation world, I worked as a transportation planner for a decade prior to this role. We talk about TDM, transportation demand management, which is basically helping people understand what their transportation choices are and making them better so that you don't feel like you have to drive to work, right? And so you can think of applying TDM to a school, right? What are the incentives that we can give for people who may live close to a school, if not necessarily in boundary, to avail themselves of all the different options there are? Kids Ride Free is kind of a version of that, right? Reducing one of the disincentives to taking public transportation. Making an intersection safer to cross on foot could have those same kind of effects, right? And the good thing is, when we make it easier for a child to walk to school, we're making it easier for everyone else to use that MND as well. So it has these sort of multiplier effects.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Henderson, you kind of touched on this in your question, but I'd love to talk a little bit about school choice. It's obviously a contentious and complicated issue in education, and I'd love to hear from all of you about how you think about school choice, what school choice means to you, and what school choice should look like in DC. Maybe Councilmember Henderson, I'll start with you, since you started to touch on that in your discussion of transportation.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like other jurisdictions have I would say more extreme versions of choice. So I mentioned in the comments, someone had asked what other jurisdictions like don't use boundaries. New York City is probably the most prominent example where they don't have traditional high school boundaries. They don't even have boundaries for middle school or junior high. It is just literally choice. And in such, students essentially, like when you're about to make a transition to the next grade, you essentially get something that looks like an old school phone book that outlines every like profiles of every school, and then it's up to you and your family to like do the research in terms of quote unquote making the best choice for you. And I think obviously there's been some research done in terms of like what it means when you have overwhelming choice, like when you are presented with too many options, kind of where do you go? And I think probably Chelsea can speak to this too, right? Even with the lottery system that we have in DC, particularly for the ECE grades, when you ask people how they picked the schools that they picked or ranked the schools that they ranked, it is proximity. It is location that is still like the number one reason why someone might have ranked something. I know even for my family, like we literally like draw a circle around our house. It was like, okay, this is where I work, this is where you work. And then we kind of have to figure out like within that, in a weird sort of like convenience factor, but also around quality of life. Do you want to sit in traffic for 45 minutes to an hour trying to get from one side to the other? Will this enable you to be able to, go watch the school play or the student presentation or whatever? I think that the choice conversation in DC has gotten really interesting, especially of late when the DC Public Charter School Board decided internally to do their own sort of moratorium on opening up new schools. Is I think them being responsive to what they are hearing in community, but also like the very real reality that enrollment was such that should you be opening 10 new schools when we don't even know if we're going to have the same number of kids that we had pre-pandemic who were enrolling. And so I think that in this next iteration of the attendance process, and also let's be really clear, I'm very clear-eyed that this is a process for DC public schools. It is not a process for public charter schools, but there is interest from folks around what does a neighborhood preference look like for a charter school. We've never pursued that, but like that is something that has sort of been in the conversation realm as well. I think robust choice is helpful. Obviously, we know that historically speaking, school boundaries were meant to keep people out. not just school boundary, well, yeah, school boundaries, city boundaries, county lines, city line, like it was all meant around exclusion. And so I think we have to sort of weigh those two. But I think also as a jurisdiction, we have said we like robust choice. The question now is choice to what extent? Choice when we have finite resources. So what does that look like? And how does that conversation fuel itself as well? But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great. Chelsea, I'll turn to you next, but I do just quickly want to plug to the audience that we're going to turn to audience questions in like about 10, 15 minutes. So if you do have a question that hasn't been asked yet, and something you're really eager to hear from the panelists, please go ahead and drop it in the chat, and I will try and ask the panelists. Great. Yeah, Chelsea, do you want to talk about school choice next?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's such a big part of education in DC, and there's a lot going on. I think first, one thing about public school choice in DC is that families make choices for all different reasons. It could be proximity, it could be school quality, however that's perceived. It could be, we know that from studies from Steve Glazerman and Dallas Daughter at Mathematica, looking at revealed preferences, families do value diversity, and this is generally that there's a part of the student body that looks like their child. So it's a certain type of diversity in most cases when we look at that. And also word of mouth, people look to their networks. We all, I'm sure, read the Brookings study about DC urban moms, or we know about what goes on. And so people are making school choices for all different reasons, but they are families' choices. And I think that is a part of the current ecosystem in DC. I think one strength of public school choice is that in DC, we do have, as Dan outlined, this strong history and this legacy of redlining and racial covenants. And this is linked to school boundaries. And it does allow for these connections to be broken a little bit, to have them loosen up. And I think in DC, we're seeing, we looked a little bit at diversity at the school level. In DC, I think about 65% of students are Black, but at half of our schools, the student body has students, 90% or more of students are Black at half of our schools. So we do have a lot of racial segregation that's occurring in our schools through, and then we do a little bit better with mixing students economically. About half of students are designated as at risk, which is primarily looking at student family income, and kind of between 40 and 70% of schools tend to have a mix of 40 to 70% of students who are at risk. So we're seeing that there is a little bit more of diversity in terms of economic status, and the schools that tend to have both of these, some racial diversity, some economic diversity, loosely defined, tend to be in wards 1 and 4. So I think one way for the boundary process and otherwise is to look at how are families making choices at these schools in wards 1 and 4 that do have these characteristics that we want to value, and how can that be replicated? Is it just a geographic issue, and how is it related to the housing mix or transportation options? I think would be really interesting moving forward.
Abby, can I respond to something that Chelsea said?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would also after years of sort of doing research and things like that around education, and especially here in DC, one of the hardest things for us to combat is reputation, right? I could change the bill. I could pour millions of dollars to change the outside of the building, which we've done. We could develop new curriculum, which we've done. We could do all of these things, but well, this school wasn't good 30 years ago. And so it's not going to work for my family because it didn't work for my family 2 generations ago, or whatever, what have you, right? And so one of the things I would say, to Chelsea's point around schools in Ward 1, schools in parts of 6, new 7, schools in 4, is that there was this concerted effort to get people into the building, to dispel the notions and the myth around what you think is happening here, right? People, we used to get calls from folks who would say, oh, well, I read on insert blog that X school is just the best option. And I would always say to those families, okay, well, tell me about your child, because And they'll say something like, oh, my student is very artistic. My student likes athletics and sports, da, 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 da. And I would say, okay, well, this school probably won't work. So they said, why? I was like, they have no gym. They have no gym, they have no outdoor space, they have no athletic teams, right? You're about to make a choice based on a blog that is actually not going to be good for your family, but they hadn't even heard of the other options as well. And so I feel like as a city, if we are saying we care about choice, but we care about diversity and having all schools, we really have to invest in folks getting to understand what's going on in buildings now and not just the fear of the unknown, which interestingly enough, and I'll probably get some comments for saying this, right? Chelsea, this is a research opportunity for you and Yesham and the folks at DC Policy Center, but I would be very interested to understand how some families are unwilling to trust the DCPS neighborhood school, but would trust a brand new charter school with no record whatsoever. Like, what is the sort of psychology there around this is a better choice, even though I know nothing about what is about to happen, versus, well, I heard the reputation of this institution was bad, even though it has changed dramatically. But there are a number of schools where I used to call them hidden gems who now have wait lists miles long of, when families find it, they hold on to it. Now we have to really have a conversation of how do we hold on to it throughout the entire feeder pattern.
Yeah, thanks. That was actually going to be a question of mine, so I'm glad you brought that up. I want to hear from Dan kind of generally about school choice, but also if you would like to also speak to what Councilmember Henderson just brought up, and Chelsea, if there's any other thoughts that you have after Dan speaks about what Councilmember Henderson just mentioned about assumptions about school and stereotypes about school, then you can feel free to jump in after that.
Yeah, well, totally. Perceptions are such a huge driver of the conversations we have, right? I showed these redlining maps, which are 80 and 90 years old, and they were basically laying out perceptions of what neighborhoods were at the time, right? And some of them were grounded in fact. This is a wealthy neighborhood, this is not. And they continue to shape how we perceive a community now, by extension, we perceive a school. And that's hard to shake for a lot of people, right? One of the things that I have wanted to see more of, at least in the county here, is just a greater effort to invite people into the school to show what's going on there. The eastern side of the county, the basically Silver Spring, White Oak, Burtonsville area, is set up as something called the consortium, which was one of the region's first experiments in school choice in the 1990s. The county received money from the federal government to basically, instead of having 3 separate high school catchments, once you got to 9th grade, you would choose between just one giant catchment. You could pick between one of the 3 high schools, and each school would have a separate signature program. And they would have an open house where you had to go and visit the school and learn about what was going on there, right? So when I was in 8th grade, I went to go visit the 3 high schools near me and see one had like a science program, one had a tech program, one had fine arts and humanities. You were literally visiting the school and seeing the teachers and the students and the building and how everything works together. And then you make a choice, right? This, over the past 25 years, has not been, it hasn't been perfect. It was intended partially to prevent segregation. It didn't work. It was intended to discourage flight. That didn't work. I'm still proud to say I went to a fine arts high school. But the big takeaway was you made people go inside the school. And if like every other school in a community could offer people that same opportunity, I think it could help dismantle some of the impressions people have, because otherwise it is just blogs. It's what your friends say. It's what you hear at events in your neighborhood. And it can really erode the sense of community when you feel like you can't put your child in the school near your house because of something a person you trust told you that may not be applicable to you. Yeah.
Thanks. Great. So thanks, Abby. I think that these ideas about kind of getting to what's driving families' perceptions, and the more that families can be in schools and see what's going on, I think the better. I think we're talking about two different things. I think the idea of shifting perceptions and boosting demand for DCPS in boundary schools is sort of like expanding the pie. Whereas when I think about boundary and redrawing the boundaries, we're more talking about redistributing the current enrollment or the current kind of where current students are assigned. And I think for that, you're sort of thinking about, well, what can the goal for that be? Is it to reduce overcrowding? Is it to increase diversity? Is it to increase access to quality? Again, however defined for certain students at certain schools. And I think I think that like the idea of perception and is important and linked to the boundary redistricting, but it's separate from this idea of redistribution.
Great, thanks. We're going to turn to some audience questions. The first of which is like just actually building off of this same thing, and it's for Councilmember Henderson. The question was, how do we counter some of these perceptions? Obviously, Chelsea and Dan just mentioned some ways. And as did you as well with thinking about just like getting people into schools. Are there other ways that we should be thinking about to counter some of these perceptions about certain DC public schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also like getting people into schools is certainly important, young people, but also most certainly parents and families so they can see what's happening as well. But I think another thing that we can be doing is creating spaces outside of the school environment for neighbors to get to know each other, right? Because if your neighbor wasn't this person who is like so scary or that you just wave to, but you never really talk to, your kids never play together, that makes it so much easier for you to say, oh, they go to the neighborhood school, they're different than us, when in fact, it's kind of all together. And so I think that double down, like for us, DC government doubling down on maintaining and creating park spaces where families can naturally gather and get to know each other and those kinds of things. Because what we have seen happen is where for some of the schools who have had enrollment peaks or bursts, it is folks who are moving together, right? I've grabbed the neighbors' hands and we are deciding we're going to all, I don't want to say jump, but like we're all going to travel through this journey and experience of public school together. And so how can, and you know, in some neighborhoods, we have really great parks and others not so much. And not just from the park standpoint, but also the safety and security around people feeling comfortable, getting to know their neighbors, getting to know their community. And that is a very, I think, odd way to kind of get at it. But I think we also know from data too, and I think some of this was covered in the series around sort of housing segregation. In certain parts of the city, if everybody just went to their neighborhood school, the school would be very diverse, like very diverse. But that's not necessarily the choices that folks are making. And so I think we have to sort of talk about schools as community centers, but how do we foster community outside of the school so that folks don't just necessarily feel comfortable saying, I'm okay living next to so-and-so, but I don't want my kids to go to school with so-and-so. And like, what does that look like? And one thing I just wanted to say, to a comment that Dan made around, and Chelsea, around diversity. I think for us in DC, we have to get real honest around what does diversity mean? For what, for whom, and how much? Because that's really what it comes down to, right? Everybody says, oh, I want a diverse school, but you have limitations on all of it, right? In terms of what your definition of diversity means.
Chelsea or Dan, would you like to add to any of that?
Yeah, the term community school can be kind of loaded. I think people sometimes use it to refer to like, this sort of gated community, with school in the middle of it. But I don't have kids, I have a dog. And one of the places where I like to take my dog every day is the elementary school 2 blocks from my house, because he likes to say hi to all the people. And it is his favorite spot to poop. And he, in 2 years, I pay money to the PTA every year. I've gotten to meet multiple teachers who like to come out and visit him. The principal knows who he is. It is, showing me in real time what the life of this school is like, so that when I do have kids, I'll be ready to put them in that school. And part of why it happens that way is because The school grounds are open to the public, the playgrounds and the fields. People in the neighborhood, a lot of them live in apartments, so they use these facilities all the time. It is always active there. The school's in a walkable neighborhood, it's up to the street, so it's, it's easy to walk by, it's not behind a big parking lot. There isn't necessarily programming that brings in the community, but there could be, right? If there was a health clinic at the school, if there was some, I know there's a school in Arlington where the auditorium is actually a community theater, right? There are lots of things we can do to take the school facilities and like just turn them out to the community just a little bit and build those relationships, particularly meaningfully to the folks who don't have kids. Because once you start incorporating them, us, and showing all the different kind of ways the school can become part of that community, I think you make an even stronger argument for why a parent would want to put their kid there.
Thanks, Abby, for another bite at the apple. I think school diversity is such a complex issue, and I think asking these questions is so necessary to talk about for whom, how much, what does it mean, and what are the trade-offs. I think when we talk about school boundaries, we are talking about how who is excluded and who is included, and who has exposure to other students, who are different to them and students who are the same as them. And when we're talking about particular boundaries like Maury and minor, we are talking about some of these diversity issues. And I think it is loaded. Is it like so that nice white parents can feel good about themselves because they have a comfortable amount of diversity at their school? Like, I think that's something that we all need to grapple with. And I think the comments that Kathy Riley just want to lift up what she's been mentioning a couple times in the chat about diversity should also mean that families who are affluent and white are traveling east. It doesn't just mean a one-way, like a one-way commute, and that's longer. But I do think that the boundaries does present a chance for us to talk about diversity in parts of the city where we have housing patterns where we have racial segregation in neighborhoods that are right next to each other, and where we could shift the boundaries by making the boundaries kind of hot dogs instead of hamburgers or something, to say like, hey, let's just slice this differently and give students a different mix of students. But I do think it's something we should think about as a city. And when we're engaging with communities for the boundaries, who cares about diversity? What does it mean to students and their families?
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat is about feeder patterns, which we haven't touched on as much, but are obviously related to school boundaries. Feeder patterns are, of course, if a student starts out in a particular pre-K program or in an elementary school, there is going to be a particular middle school that they then feed into, and then a high school that they feed into. And the person in the chat specifically asked what has been happening in more gentrifying sections of the city in regard to feeder patterns. Are we seeing more privileged and white children attending elementary schools, continuing on to their neighborhood middle schools and high schools? Building strong pre-kindergarten neighborhood feeder patterns in our city outside of Ward 3 has to be part of the solution to our hyper-segregated schools. So I'll let anyone jump in on that question about like how we should be thinking about feeder patterns and equity.
I was going to say, Chelsea probably has the data here, but I mean, the unfortunate reality is there is still a challenge in terms of DCPS where we could be going gangbusters in ECE, but as you go up towards the 5th grade, enrollment declines, but also the demographic of the student also changes as well. And then in some cases, it'll pop back for specialized high schools, but not necessarily for the comprehensive neighborhood high schools. So we haven't necessarily achieved that. We have a lot of families who like, the idea of free pre-K 3 and pre-K 4, and then decide to make other options beyond that. And I think we should also question some of that too, right? Like, why is it cool for the 3 and 4 year old, but like once we get to 1st grade, all of a sudden, oh no, we can't stay here. So it's a challenge, but that's the reality.
Yeah, I think feeder patterns are really important to examine. As the council member was saying, we've looked a little bit at participation in public schools as students grow older. In general, we have a lot of students who exit either DC, their families move out of DC, or they choose to attend private school over time. When you look at we looked at this rough measure of the number of babies born in DC to the number of students who are in pre-K3 and kindergarten, 5th grade, 8th grade, and high school, and so on. By the time we get to high school, 40% of the babies who are born in DC on net, right, are not in our public schools. So there is, and like what the council member was talking about, who's leaving, where are they going, affects feeder patterns. Which feeder patterns are they leaving more, makes a difference for the numbers of students who are still there. I think for the boundary, when we think about redrawing the boundaries, it's not just the lines of the feeder, it's not just the lines of the middle and high schools that can be considered, but also the feeder patterns when we're thinking about how we're going to maybe meet some of these objectives around that the city may choose around overcrowding or diversity or increasing access to certain schools for certain students. I do think feeder patterns is something to consider.
Dan?
I have less experience with this kind of demographic change, but I definitely think there are opportunities to take advantage of schools that are next to each other but might be in different clusters or pyramids, being allowed to switch into the other. I know in the county we have something called split articulation, where an elementary school might feed into 2 middle schools depending on which neighborhoods you're in, and that becomes a way to put a little bit more whatever diversity you need in either school. I mentioned a little bit about the consortia earlier, which is basically this feeder pattern in which you have a bunch of elementary schools that feed into middle schools that feed into 3 or 5 high schools, and just you can choose which high school you want. And there have been a lot of tweaks to it over the past 25 years, but the basic idea is you have your local school that you're guaranteed, and you can enter a lottery for one of the other 2. And the thinking, I think, behind it is sound, right? Like that you have these choices that are all somewhat close to your house. I know Louisville, Kentucky, which is one of the school systems that Montgomery County looked at in its boundary analysis, does a similar thing where like each sort of chunk of the city has a bunch of elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools that you can all choose between. So you're guaranteed a school within some proximity to your house. And that, that allows people at least some promise will be close to home. I think those are examples I've seen that might address and some of these issues, maybe smooth out some of the more dramatic demographic change that you might see in a neighborhood.
Great, thanks. We are coming close to time, so I am going to combine 2 questions that will sort of hopefully offer the opportunity for everyone to look forward a little bit and summarize some of the ways that I've been thinking about everything that we've talked about tonight. I would like to ask what is admittedly not an easy question, but what does success look like when we think about equitable education in DC? What is sort of like your vision of a city where students have equal chance to get a solid education and feel safe doing so? And then another question in the chat was, what can individual residents do to help create that vision? I'll start with Councilmember Henderson.
Abby, that's like a very meaty question.
Yeah, sorry.
What's your vision for equity? I will say this, right? Like one of the reasons I ran for public office is because I felt like your zip code shouldn't determine your opportunity for success. And I think that should sort of carry over in terms of what we talk about from an education standpoint. Your zip code should not determine your opportunity for educational experiences, educational exposure, or wherever you go from primary to secondary to post-secondary success. And how residents can do that, I mean, it's sort of committing into being involved in the process, but also rejecting the premise of some of the things that are going to be posed to you in this conversation, right? So it is inevitable that even if you don't have children, there are probably going to be people who are paying attention to the attendance zone boundary conversation, because it is something that will stick with us for 10 years, right? And so I think it's very important for people to be clear-eyed on what the goals are, but also recognize too, like, it's going to get meaty, it's going to get messy, and we have to sort of lean into that, because at the end of the day, we still have a job to do. And again, it goes down to not just around the educational piece, but also about resources. can we just continue building schools on one part of the city, or do we change the lines so that underutilized buildings are more utilized, and sort of having that conversation? So as you said, sort of looking forward on this piece, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I cringe as I think about it, but I feel like it's important for us to do these periodic checks, not just in terms of the school community or the education community, but a periodic check within the city in terms of, are our values or are our actions living out the values of what we want to see from an educational equity standpoint?
Great, thank you. Chelsea, I'll turn to you next.
Wow. So I think I'm not able to speak to, I really like the vision that the council member talked about. I think I'll take a narrower scope, and I hope it's not disappointing, but just think about what education equity might mean in this boundary redrawing process, kind of coming back to the, like what we've been talking about all night. And I think for me, to have equity in this, in these outcomes around boundaries, I would really love for DC, in collaboration with communities, to think about what the goal should be for this. Again, are we trying to do something about overcrowding? Are we trying to shift student composition at schools? Are we trying to increase access for certain students? And also that we hear throughout this process from families in wards 2 and 3 and pockets of Capitol Hill who are really bought into their in-boundary DCPS schools, and families in areas of the city where the boundary school is not their preferred option at this point. What's working for them, what isn't, and what can be changed through redrawing the lines? Where is it realistic to kind of use this as a mechanism for change? And then also, if there's a way to look at what has changed since the last boundary process, which schools are experiencing overcrowding, how have the 6 DCPS citywide schools that have opened since last time, how has that changed the landscape? Just kind of thinking about outlining for me, like, what are the goals of this process, and being transparent about that from the beginning and hearing from a variety of stakeholders.
Great, thank you. Not disappointing at all. Good to think broad and then slightly narrower. Dan?
Could you mind repeating the question? My dog has been barking.
Yeah, totally fine. My question was, as everyone pointed out, an admittedly very ambitious one, but what is your vision for education equity? Like, how do we build an education system where kids have an equal shot at getting a solid education and feeling safe and successful doing so? And are there things, and the question in the chat was, are there things that individual citizens can do to help build that system?
Wow. Okay. I would say parity in school funding. Can the public sector offset what private, parents can do, in terms of PTA funding? Regular school boundary changes so that this becomes a process that's natural to the community, and also is making sure we're using our resources most effectively. And the other side of it, because we are at a GGWash event, zoning. Right? We need to have zoning that allows a variety of housing types in a variety of different neighborhoods, so we don't have neighborhoods where there's just one type of very expensive house, one neighborhood where there isn't. A lot of the conversations we have about school boundaries are because school boundaries are drawn in physical space, and the physical spaces we live in are segregated. For the individual person, I mean, you should send your kid to a public school. Like, I think that's the first thing you can do, is to give the public schools in your community a serious chance. And then beyond that, you have to make a choice that's best for your kid. I don't know if it's always fair to say you personally can fix a systemic problem, but I think if you have the privilege to choose, availing yourself of all of the choices you have can be your little bit of contribution to a more equitable outcome.
Great, thank you so much. I think that is a really good place to end things. I'm sorry for the questions in the chat that we didn't get to, but we obviously hope that this panel is just the beginning of these conversations. We clearly have a lot of work ahead of us, and a lot of exciting and daunting issues to continue thinking about. So I first want to thank all of our panelists for taking time in their evening to talk about these issues. I also personally want to thank them for talking to me before this for these articles. Thank you all for your work and for your time. And thank you to our audience for attending this discussion. I think it's really exciting how much energy there clearly is around improving these issues. And yeah, I feel really honored that we all get to be a part of it. And we also want to thank Education Forward DC for the grant funding that allowed us to do this series and to discuss all of these important issues. So with that, I will close things out. Thank you again for all attending, and yeah, look forward to seeing you on the internet and in the schools. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.